It's time for another Power Rankings video, and this time, North America is up. Now, North America might be a little bit trickier. One, because I'm a bit less familiar with the region, but two, because while we saw them play in the Face It playoffs like we did with EMEA, they didn't play on the Juno patch, so we've not actually seen any of these teams play a public match with Juno enabled. So we don't know who's looking the best in these competitions, we don't know who's looking strongest. So there's a lot of inference and guessing we're going to have to do based on how we've seen the comps operate in EMEA and Korea, the things that are important, aka better macro, better understanding, better discipline, and applying that to the teams and the rosters we have in front of us. So we're going to have to do maybe a little bit more guesswork with North America than we do in EMEA, where we have a little bit more facts and evidence and science to prove our points, but we can do it. So let me take you to the Power Rankings sheet. If you've not seen this before, what we have is all the teams that have qualified. Obviously, the top four qualified from the four highest finishers in Stage 3. And then we had all of the other teams qualify from the Swiss in the order they qualify from the Swiss. We've got the rosters next to these teams with the tank players in green, the DPS players in pink, and the support players in blue. You can see, for whatever reason, Remarkable Punch, they have so many DPS players, we've had to just expand the DPS pool just to fit them all in, but they've got their 5 DPS players, so they're surely covered for every possible situation, but we'll get to them later. The way this is set up in reality is there are 4 groups of 4 where the top 2 teams from each group will play a GSL style bracket where the top 2 go out and into the top 8 playoffs and the rest gets eliminated. Now, we're just going to rank 16th to 1st, but hopefully you can then put in this order, apply it to the groups and kind of figure out who I think will get out of groups first. So we'll start at the bottom first, as we always do, which means we're going to have to delve into the depths of North America, which means my knowledge of all the players is not as deep as it is in EMEA, so we're going to have to make a lot of assumptions, we're going to have to make a few guesses, we're going to have to jump to a few conclusions, and we'll have to go a lot more off vibe, name recognition. We're going to put a lot of stock in brands we recognize and really discriminate against names we're less familiar with. So as I go down the list of teams I would sort of put in that bottom half, I think there's 2 teams that maybe stand out to me as the ones I'm least familiar with, which is EXN Zenith and Blastoff Buds. So not overly familiar with even these rosters. I didn't catch a lot of North America Swiss either, so I'm not overly familiar with either of the teams, even though we can obviously see that at least in the Swiss qualification, Zenith qualified higher. So the way we're going to divide these 2 teams is based on their player names. And I think I want to draw your attention to 2 player names in particular. On one side, we have Ace T Killer, all capitals, serious, means business, excited to see them do some Ace T killing. On the other side, Blastoff Buds have Frothy Philly, which, Frothy Philly is 7, sorry to use their full name, which really just compels me to put them bottom of the rankings, if I'm being honest. I see that name and I'm just compelled to put them low down, which means Zenith can take this 15th spot above them. Then what we get after we divide the killers and the Phillies, we have probably a pretty big group of teams where I'm not as familiar with the players. So again, we're going to sort of vibe our way through. I think actually YFP Gaming, I'm going to put towards the top of this group. And that's mainly because I think they've had some success as well before, as Vice didn't look too bad in the Face It playoffs. Likewise, they've now added Ade to the roster. They've got a Korean hit scan in there, so maybe that bumps them up a little bit. So I'm willing to buy into the concept that Korean equals good, and therefore the fact that they have a Korean player will bump them up a little bit in this ranking. Likewise, I think Avidity are a team that have done reasonably well. I think solid backline, Bunner particular highlights as well. So I'm quite happy to put them reasonably high up here as well. Ramatra Punch are the team I'm also going to put up around here. I think Derpy's probably the player I'm most familiar with, even though most of that familiarity comes from subbing in for Zeb on Citrus Nation, playing mostly Reinhardt and having a very bad time ultimately in most of these games in like the later group stages or even sometimes top 8. So it's not the greatest memories I have of Derpy, but between him, the fact that they've got Salmon and Angelic, which I think is a solid backline, we've got 5 DPS players, so there's got to be a couple of decent ones in there at least. I feel like they might actually be on the upper side of this, so possible I even underrated them, but you know, when I see a Reinhardt team in EMEA, I'm full of belief and faith. When I see a Reinhardt team in North America, zero faith. Absolutely zero faith. So possibly just discrimination on my part, but I think it's going to turn out to be correct, honestly. So I'm happy to back it up. Then the other teams are really Absolution and Tanuki Tapaya. I think I'm going to put Absolution at the bottom of these. I think, well, obviously Kiwi is British, or at least partly British, so I feel compelled to at least bump him up a little bit off bottom. I think this team is probably, again, not a lot of overly familiar names. I think Monkey Happy, Amadian, I think I've seen play before, done okay. But I have to, we said we're going to go with brand recognition, so there's a few more recognizable brands and names on the other side. Then Tanuki Tapira, the other team that are going to sort of fit in the middle here. Now, I've seen these teams play occasionally, or like a few of these players at least play occasionally. I think Z Panther, very solid flex support. J-Man, good DPS as well. Obviously, I'm desperately intrigued, even though I think it's actually mainly Anhu and J-Man who start a lot of the games. I'm desperately intrigued to know more about Jeremy87, because when I see a name all lowercase Jeremy87, the implication must be that this is just someone's first account on something. Presumably somebody named Jeremy, presumably born in the year 87. So I'm really, really hoping Jeremy87 is indeed a person called Jeremy, born in the year 1987. And if it's not, I'm going to be devastated. But I choose to believe. I hope we see him play. I'm very excited to see Jeremy87. So then we get to the top 8, and it's kind of serious business now, right? The teams we expect to get out of groups mostly, the teams we expect to do quite well, and even challenge for some of the more significant placements as well. I think just outside the cusp of that top 8, the team I'm going to put is Shout Tour here. The team did very well in Swiss, second overall in Swiss. They have 2 Koreans as well, Elva and KHD, and as we established before, Korean equals good, so I feel like this should bump them up a little bit. But I feel once we get to the top 8, we're actually talking about pretty serious teams for the most part. So unless it's like a really all-star Korean, like when M80 had Pelican and Happy type thing, I don't know if it would make a real dent against any of the more established teams here. Then above Shout 2, I'm actually going to put Team Z, which is maybe a bit of a surprise here. I think they did quite well in Face It playoffs. I've been impressed with Peace and Painkiller. I think I've worked well before. And I think X10, always a star for a team, always. When she's in the roster, when she's able to play hit scan, always a chance that she can just carry them through. And I think Ash is still pretty viable in a lot of these situations. So excited to see X10 play. And I think Team Z will do a lot better than they did in Swiss once we come round to the actual main event of it all. Obviously, they might suffer a little bit because their group's more difficult based on how poorly they did in Swiss. So I don't know if I still think they might be a top 8 team, even if we don't actually see them in the top 8 based on how the groups went. Then above Team Z, it probably came down to a bit of a 50-50 for me between Shikigami and Fluffy Dreamland. I think I'm going to go with Shikigami because while they're a team that have really kind of established themselves as a pretty consistently sort of around top 8 team, they've really struggled to sort of go beyond that and start punching into, say, the top 5 or something. And I think they've made a few roster changes here, most notably Taejong and Sunjun coming in, 2 Korean players, obviously expected to be playing on pretty high ping. And wow, for those of you who saw Sunjun actually go and play on Haejuk Dan in Korea OWCS, I was actually really impressed by his performances, both on hitscan and on the flex DPS. I thought he was a big part of why Haejuk Dan were doing so well, but when he was back on TSM, I wasn't blown away by his performances. And I don't think this is necessarily because he's a significantly better player between going from TSM into Haejuk Dan. I think some of it is just for ping, the time of day they're going to have to be playing. So as much as on paper these feel like pretty big signings for Shikigami, have to obviously mention as well that Fleta has joined as coach. Can't forget that one. Wrap your minds around that when you can. But having these 2 Korean players, both playing on high ping, difficult time of day, I don't know if they'll quite the upgrade Shikigami I'm maybe hoping for. So as much as I'm interested to see how these signings unfold, I'm still not sure I'm going to actually move Shikigami that far up. Even though I think they've done well to establish themselves as a team across the year. And I think when I look at if we're going to be playing more Juno Brig, the fact that they can have Graveyard and Annie and both in seems a nice little advantage for them as well. I think all the teams above them are ultimately a bit better placed. And the first team I'm going to actually put above them is Fluffy Dreamland. I've actually been really impressed with Fluffy Dreamland. I think they're a team that have always shown promise, but quite often fail or choke in one of the important games and don't quite live up to the potential they have. But again, when I look at this roster, I look at Chime, I look at Ryan, I think 2 players I'm really excited about. And then I think the heroes they're going to be able to play, maybe Ryan, maybe better known for his Tracer, but Chime getting to play the Mei, probably the dinkiest Mei in the whole region. Then Astro has looked pretty solid for him on every tank they've had. Backline seems solid. I think there's a lot of positives for Fluffy Dreamland, and I hope they actually maybe get to even cause a couple of upsets or prove the level of or live up to some of the potential their roster actually has, because I feel like that's been something they've been lacking in a lot of their tournament runs so far. So hopefully stage 4, final one, hopefully this is the one for them. I think it lines up quite nicely. Double flex DPS being played a lot. Chime and Ryan both available on the roster. I feel there's a lot of positives to look at here for Fluffy Dreamland, and I think this might be actually one of their better stages yet. Then we get to our top 5, and I think there's a pretty clear divide in our top 5 now. We obviously didn't get to see Nightmare, NRG, or Toronto play in the Face It playoffs, but I think, regardless of that, just based on roster strength alone, I think they just stay the top 3, which means the 4th and 5th battle becomes a TSM versus Citrus Nation situation. Both teams have changed their roster slightly. We see Kufa coming in, Doomed also coming in, Luke Mino coming in, and then for TSM is now Riker, Rocket, King, Vision, Squid, and Liar. So I've got to decide which way round I want to put this in. And to be fair, I think a lot of these signings are actually pretty good. I think Riker, even though we've not seen a lot of him this year, I think a really reasonable tank player, and I'm glad we're going to get to see more of as the only tank on this roster. Rocket and King, I think, have proven a very good double flex DPS combo. Likewise, Vision, while lacking sometimes, clearly has the talent, just can't always quite put it to use as you would like. And I actually think Squid and Liar, huge fan of this backline. I think outside for top 3, this has to be the best backline available. And I think depending on the heroes as well, can maybe even see him jump above maybe like or at least compete with a CJ Admiral as well. Then, to be fair with Citrus Nation, I quite like their signings as well. I think adding Luke to the roster is a nice addition, especially as we potentially move into like a Brig Juno type meta. It's very nice to have someone like Luke who can flex between both roles. Likewise, I think Doomed is a nice addition. This DPS like Tap, Doomed, Chronic actually seems pretty well balanced. We've got the hit scan, we've got the double flex DPS players. All seems really reasonable. But the biggest signing for Citrus Nation, but when it is the real game changer, I think is actually Kufa. While they still have Zeb, who has a very particular set of skills and is very good when asked to use those particular set of skills, they've struggled with flexibility, whereas Kufa, I think very well rounded, probably wants to be playing a lot more Winston and other things, but all of a sudden it feels like Citrus Nation now have a bunch more of the meta comps open to them, and this will benefit the rest of their roster. I now look at the Citrus Nation roster and think, they can actually probably just play most comps with the free DPS lineup, the free support lineup, Kufa and Zeb. They've got most things covered, so now all of a sudden Citrus Nation won't just have these big power spikes when things line up for them, seem a little bit more well-rounded. So saying all that, trying to factor all of that in, I think I'm actually still going to go Citrus Nation in 5th, actually. As much as they do always find a way to upset some of these TSM players, or some of the, as they were called, Timeless players, or as they were called, Luminosity players, as much as that always seems to happen, I think this time, Squid, Vision, King, they're going to break the curse. I can feel it. This time, they will get past them. I actually really like this TSM roster. I think Rocket, King, really strong double flex DPS. I think Squid and Liar, one of the better backlines really in North America, definitely better than Citrus Nation's backline, I think. So I think TSM, when we start talking about what's important in this meta, where the strengths are, I think it's going to be, if we're going to get the same that we see in EMEA, the same we see in Korea, we're going to get lots of Juno Brig, lots of Ramatra, lots of Diva. It's going to become a macro heavy meta, lots of complicated ult fights, lots of ult layering, and I think ultimately TSM may be better suited to deal with more of that. I think Citrus Nation, when we've seen them have success in the past, they've always felt like a very momentum-based team, a very free-flowing team, based a lot around lethal success. And I feel like that doesn't suit this type of meta as much. So I would expect TSM to have the advantage there, and I expect that to translate into the final standings as well. Which, of course, then brings us to the top 3. And the top 3 is kind of interesting, because the easy thing to do would probably just be Toronto on top, NRG still probably the second strongest roster, then maybe Nightmare in 3rd. And we've not really seen any of the teams play, we've not seen them play in this meta, so it all kind of seems reasonable on the surface, that they'll roughly maintain their respective power levels in all of this. But I think this is maybe one of these metas where suddenly Toronto might struggle a little bit more if they are forced to play some of this Brig Juno. I think while the Brig Juno won't be a problem for the backline, I think actually RuPaul and Vega will probably, as they often do, end up being the standout pair in North America on these respective heroes. I think it does maybe put them in a bit of a tricky situation with DPS. Can they keep Merit on Ash for most of their games? Hopefully so. Will Sugar-Free be playing the Mei? Will he have the same impact he's able to have on Tracer, Echo, Farah that we've seen recently? I'm not so sure. Likewise, while Ramatra is a very good hero for someone, when we have seen Toronto their most vulnerable, at least domestically in North America, it has been on these Brawl Mirrors. Think back to maybe when they lost to what ultimately became the Nightmare Core, in that Malga mirror, dropping maps to them. This has been one of their weakest ones. So if it's a brawl-heavy meta, it'll be interesting to see how Toronto match up, especially now NRG and Nightmare are now significant threats. The question marks around the DPS as well, especially how are they going to use Sugar-Free, how are they going to use Merit, can they get them onto heroes that are good for them? But ultimately, it is Toronto. Rupal and Vega have a very good Brig Juno. I think Vega, again, will excel at this type of hero as well, being able to play the Juno, much as he provided such a big Alari threat in some of their biggest successes so far this year. I think Juno will be another hero Vega will excel at and will really push Toronto over the edge. So even though this could be closer for Toronto, we see them going into meta that's a bit brawl heavy and one that they've maybe not excelled in the past. I still just feel it's so hard to back against this team. As much as it's stage 4, they've qualified anyway. Remember, you get better seeding if you win stage 4. So I think Toronto is still going to be keen to make sure they get a better seeding spot, make sure they win this stage, make sure they finish the year with a perfect domestic record, all 4 stage championships. I think even though there's a few reasons to worry about Toronto, I think ultimately still just too good for this competition. Then we get to the NRG Nightmare situation, head to head. I think both these teams have the quality to be clear of TSM and Citrus Nation. As much as both those teams have made good roster moves, I think Nightmare and NRG, they both have massive rosters. They both have very complete rosters. We saw that in some of NRG's success over Toronto in the previous stage, and that they can just sub in the right players to play every composition. I think that'll benefit them here as well. Now, maybe becomes a question here where actually who's going to be the best in this big macro meta. And I think, again, if I think back historically, this Nightmare Core have been the more successful one, say, in the Malga meta. So I think, actually, I'm going to put Nightmare ahead of NRG right now. We didn't get to see them play in Stage 3, so I feel like this NRG-Nightmare rivalry is still bubbling under the surface. We've not actually seen it come to a head. But based on what I think the meta should be, or most likely will be, I think it's actually one that suits Nightmare a lot better. Obviously, NRG have plenty of firepower. They have the players to cover all of these heroes, and will still be better than most teams. I think actually this suits Nightmare a lot more. I think it'll be really close between the teams. But right now, for me, Nightmare have the edge, at least based on paper, historical precedent, all of those things, even though we've not really seen the two teams play these matchups all that much. So, that's the power rankings. Am I happy with it all? I'll start at the top. Toronto, yeah, easy. easy one to start with. Nightmare, NRG, yeah, maybe this is probably going to be one of the more controversial ones. I feel like people could go both ways on this. Really interested to see how it works out. TSM, Citrus Nation, I'm pretty confident in that. I mean, Citrus Nation always tend to perform above whatever expectations you have for Citrus Nation. They always seem to perform above them, so have to factor that in. Fluffy Dreamland are actually a team I think could cause an upset above them, so really excited to see them play. Shikigami, I'm fascinated to see how it works out with Fleta and Taejong and Sunjun, but I'm not convinced it's going to work out that well. I'm skeptical to say the least. Team Z, I think, will do a lot better than they did in Swiss, even if they may be screwed a little bit by their groups. Retiny's, yeah, I feel okay about. Even though really once we get below like the sort of like Team Z Shout 2 line, this is where everything gets a little bit murky for me. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know your power rankings. This is what I'm going with. I'm locking this in. We'll see if I'm right or wrong come the end of the stage. I think especially once we get to the top 3, top 5, is really competitive for the most part, and this could be an interesting test for Toronto, their final stage, and they've got to solve a problem that they've not always done massively well on in the past either. So, excited to see that. Of course, let me know your power rankings below. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think I've got wrong. Who am I underrating? Who am I overrating? What should we really expect from North America? If are they even going to play the same meta as we've seen in other regions? And if they do, who's going to be the best team at that meta? So, be sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And I'll see you in the next one.